What if I told you that during humanity's darkest hour, when the Black Death consumed Europe like a ravenous beast, there lived a man who claimed the plague itself spoke to him, not in nightmares or fever dreams, but in clear, commanding whispers that turned entire villages into his devoted followers? Today, we dive into the forgotten chronicle of Prince Aldric of Moravia, whose conversations with pestilence would make even the most hardened historians question the boundaries between madness and divine revelation. The year was 1348. Europe was drowning in its own blood and pus. 1 in 3 people were dead or dying, and the survivors huddled in terror, waiting for the inevitable. But in the remote principality of Moravia, nestled between the mountains of what we now call the Czech Republic, something far stranger than death was stirring. Prince Aldric was not born into darkness. Historical records describe him as a learned man, fluent in 7 languages, with a passion for astronomy and medicine. He had studied at the University of Paris, corresponded with scholars across Europe, and was known for his rational approach to governance. But when the plague reached Moravia in the autumn of 1348, something in Aldric shattered like glass under a hammer. The first sign came when his own physician, Master Johann, fell ill. As the learned doctor writhed in his deathbed, covered in the telltale black boils, Aldric spent 3 days and nights by his side, refusing food or sleep. Witnesses later testified that on the 3rd night, they heard 2 voices coming from the chamber, though only Aldric emerged alive at dawn. What he claimed to have heard that night would echo through the corridors of his castle, and eventually reach every corner of his domain. According to Aldric, the plague had spoken to him, not as some metaphorical force, but as a conscious entity with desires, plans, and most terrifyingly of all, specific instructions for the living. The first command the plague allegedly gave him was simple: gather the dying. Within days, Aldric had issued a decree that all plague victims in his territory must be brought to designated houses in each village. His soldiers, many already infected themselves, obeyed without question. But here's where the story takes its first truly disturbing turn. Instead of these becoming death houses, as logic would dictate, many of the gathered victims began to recover. News of miraculous healings spread faster than the disease itself. Pilgrims from across the Holy Roman Empire began flooding into Moravia, carrying the plague with them, yet somehow, under Aldric's guidance, the death rate in his principality dropped to nearly 0. The prince claimed this was because he was following the plague's instructions perfectly, treating it not as an enemy, but as a visitor with specific needs that once met, would move on peacefully. But the plague's demands grew stranger by the week. Aldric announced that the disease required daily conversations with him, held in complete darkness in the depths of his castle. During these sessions, which sometimes lasted for hours, servants reported hearing not one voice, but multiple voices speaking in languages that didn't exist. Some claimed they heard the voices of the recently dead, others swore they heard children speaking in the tongues of ancient Rome. The second major command came in winter. The plague wanted to see the faces of every person in the principality, not through Aldric's eyes, but directly. The prince ordered that all subjects, healthy or sick, must present themselves before a massive mirror he had commissioned from Venetian craftsmen. This mirror, nearly 10 feet tall and framed in silver, was installed in the great hall of his castle. One by one, every man, woman, and child in Moravia filed past this mirror while Aldric stood beside it, whispering constantly in what witnesses described as a mixture of Latin, Greek, and sounds that resembled no human language. Many reported that their reflection looked wrong somehow, older or younger, or bearing the face of someone they had never seen. Others claimed their reflection moved independently, gesturing or mouthing words they weren't speaking. But the most unsettling detail came from Father Benedict, the court chaplain, who kept detailed records of these proceedings. According to his notes, people who looked sickly or weak when they approached the mirror often appeared healthy and vigorous when they walked away. Meanwhile, some who had seemed perfectly healthy upon arrival left looking pale and drawn, as if something had been taken from them. The third command pushed Aldric's followers to the very edge of sanity. In the spring of 1349, he announced that the plague wished to speak through the mouths of the living. He selected 24 individuals, men and women from all walks of life, to serve as what he called voice bearers. These chosen few would enter a trance-like state, during which, Aldrich claimed, the plague would use their vocal cords to communicate directly with the populace. Contemporary accounts describe gatherings where these voice bearers would speak simultaneously, creating a cacophonous chorus of overlapping words and phrases. Yet somehow, those who heard these sessions claimed they could understand every word perfectly, as if each person was hearing a personalized message meant only for them. The content of these messages ranged from mundane advice about daily life to prophecies about the future of Europe. One message, recorded by multiple witnesses, stands out as particularly chilling. Speaking through a 12-year-old girl named Margareta, the plague allegedly said, "I am not your destroyer. I am your teacher. Through death, I show you life. Through fear, I show you courage. Through separation, I show you unity. But know this, I am not alone in the darkness between worlds. Others watch and wait, and some are far less patient than I." By midsummer 1349, Moravia had become something unprecedented in plague-ravaged Europe, a functioning society where the disease existed but rarely killed. Visitors reported that plague victims walked freely among the healthy, their boils and symptoms visible, but somehow dormant. Children played games that involved mimicking the symptoms of the disease. Markets operated normally, with both the sick and healthy conducting business side by side. But this unnatural harmony came with a price that grew more apparent as autumn approached. The people of Moravia had begun to change in subtle but disturbing ways. They moved with an odd synchronization, often walking in step without apparent coordination. They spoke in unison during daily prayers, though no one had taught them to do so. Most unsettling of all, they had developed an intense aversion to leaving their principality, as if some invisible force prevented them from crossing the borders. Merchants, who had once traveled freely throughout the region, now refused to venture beyond Moravian territory. Soldiers abandoned their posts rather than accompany diplomatic missions to neighboring lands. When pressed for explanations, they all gave variations of the same answer. Leaving felt like dying. The final command from the plague came in October 1349, exactly 1 year after Aldrich's first claimed conversation with the disease. This time, the message was delivered not through the voice-bearers or whispered conferences, but through Aldrich himself, who stood before his entire assembled population and spoke in a voice that witnesses swore was not his own. "The teaching is complete," he said, though his lips barely moved and the words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You have learned to live with death, to embrace the darkness, to find unity in suffering. But every lesson has its test. Choose now, remain as you are, forever touched by my presence, or return to your former ignorance and face what comes after me. What happened next depends on which account you believe." Father Benedict's official record states that the prince collapsed immediately after speaking these words and died within the hour, his body showing signs of advanced plague despite having appeared perfectly healthy moments before. With his death, the mysterious protection over Moravia ended, and the plague resumed its natural course, killing roughly half the population within 3 months. But other sources tell a different story. A merchant named Wilhelm of Nuremberg, writing 20 years later, claimed that he passed through Moravia in 1350 and found it completely abandoned. Not destroyed by plague or war, but simply empty, as if every living soul had simply vanished. Buildings stood intact, personal belongings remained undisturbed, and meals were left half-eaten on tables, but not a single human being could be found anywhere in the principality. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the account of Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, who conducted an official church investigation into the events in Moravia in 1352. His sealed report, discovered in the Vatican archives only in 1923, describes finding the famous mirror still standing in the Great Hall of Aldrich's castle. But according to the cardinal, the mirror no longer reflected the viewer's image. Instead, It showed scenes of people living normal lives in what appeared to be a thriving medieval community. Completely unaware that they were being observed, the cardinal ordered the mirror destroyed. But his report notes that even after it was shattered into thousands of pieces, each fragment continued to display the same impossible scenes. The pieces were eventually collected and buried in consecrated ground, though the cardinal admitted he could never be certain they had found every fragment. Modern historians have struggled to separate fact from fiction in the tale of Prince Aldric and his conversations with the plague. Records from the period are sparse and often contradictory. The Principality of Moravia itself seems to have been largely forgotten by contemporary chroniclers, appearing in only a handful of documents, most of which were discovered centuries later in private collections or monastery archives. Yet certain details persist across multiple independent sources. The unusually low death rate in the region during the height of the plague years, the reports of strange gatherings and unusual behavior among the local population, the sudden and complete abandonment of the territory sometime in the early 1350s, and most puzzling of all, the recurring accounts of travelers who claim to have encountered people from Moravia decades or even centuries after the Principality's supposed end, always in remote locations and always carrying silver mirrors. Some modern researchers have suggested that the entire story is an elaborate medieval hoax, designed to explain the natural phenomenon of certain isolated communities developing immunity to plague through repeated exposure. Others point to possible psychological explanations: mass hysteria, shared delusions brought on by trauma and starvation, or the effects of ergot poisoning from contaminated grain. But there's one detail that none of these rational explanations can adequately address. In 1967, during construction of a highway through the former territory of Moravia, workers discovered a sealed chamber beneath what historical surveys identified as the foundation of Prince Aldric's castle. Inside this chamber, they found 24 perfectly preserved bodies, arranged in a circle around a single chair. The bodies showed no signs of decay despite being buried for over 6 centuries. More disturbing still, each corpse's mouth was filled with silver, as if molten metal had been poured down their throats while they were still alive, and carved into the chair at the center of the circle was a message in Latin that translates roughly to, "Here lie the voice-bearers," who spoke the words that were not words, in service to the teacher who was not a teacher. The discovery was classified by the Czechoslovakian government, and the site was quickly sealed and covered over. The official report listed the find as medieval religious artifacts of no historical significance. But copies of the original excavation photos occasionally surface online, showing images that seem to defy rational explanation. Perhaps most unsettling of all, construction workers at the site reported that while the highway was being built, they frequently heard voices coming from beneath the new pavement, always at night, always in languages they couldn't identify, and always seeming to originate from directly underneath whatever section of road they happened to be working on. The highway remains in use today, carrying thousands of travelers through what was once Prince Aldric's domain. Most drive through without incident, unaware of the dark history buried beneath the asphalt, but some drivers report strange experiences. Radios picking up broadcasts in medieval Latin, GPS systems directing them to destinations that don't exist, or catching glimpses of figures in plague masks standing just beyond the tree line. And sometimes, late at night, when the highway is empty and fog rolls down from the mountains, travelers claim they can hear something else beneath the hum of their engines, a sound like whispered conversations, growing louder as they drive deeper into what was once Moravia, until it becomes unmistakably clear that the voices are coming from inside their own cars. The story of Prince Aldric and his conversations with the plague remains one of history's most haunting mysteries. Whether you believe he was a madman who led his people to destruction, a visionary who discovered something profound about the nature of life and death, or something else entirely, one thing is certain: in humanity's darkest hour, when civilization itself seemed on the verge of collapse, some people found ways to survive that challenge everything. We think we know about the boundaries between the living and the dead, And if the accounts are true, if somewhere beyond the veil between worlds, there really are entities that watch and wait for opportunities to interact with humanity, then perhaps the Black Death was never just a disease. Perhaps it was something much older and far more intelligent than we dare to imagine. Something that chose to teach rather than destroy, to communicate rather than simply kill. Something that even now might still be listening for those brave or foolish enough to try to speak with the darkness. That the next time you find yourself driving alone on a remote highway, especially one that cuts through ancient lands where old tragedies played out, listen carefully to the sounds around you, because according to those who claim to have experienced it firsthand, once you learn to hear the voices that exist in the spaces between words, you might discover that you're never truly alone on the road, and that perhaps is the most terrifying lesson the plague ever taught.